I was 21, recently became a police officer, and was also recently dumped. So my friend suggested Tinder. As a 21-year-old and new cop, I had the I'm invincible and I can take on anyone mentality. I matched with a very good-looking, out-of-my-league female. We chatted, and eventually set up a date to meet. She said she had a great open field to look at stars and hang out, and we could meet up at her house. So the night came, I was excited, and she seemed to be excited when I picked her up. She guided me to the field, and it looked nice. Open space, woods, deer and other wildlife. In the field, I noticed really dim headlights in the distance. Then, the van started driving towards us, and pulled up in front of us, almost close enough to block me from going forward. I told her to stay in the car, and I'll go say hi. I grabbed my flashlight I had in the car, and walked up. In the front driver's side of the van, there was a decently sized man. I asked him what's going on, and if he could back his car up a little bit. He was very polite, said he was the owner of the property, and said he didn't mean to scare us. He told me he's been having trouble with poachers on his property, and just wanted to make sure we weren't going to be shooting at anything. I assured him we only came out to look at some stars and wildlife. He was perfectly okay with that, told me to have a nice date, and drove away. After that, the girl was texting non-stop. Around an hour later, I saw headlights coming towards us again, this time at a really fast pace. We hopped in the car, and I moved it to a more defensive position. The same man came close enough to almost hit my car. She hopped out of the car at that point and ran towards the guy. I immediately knew I was fucked. I got out and gave them commands to back up and get on the ground. Neither of them complied. Obviously. He then proceeded to charge me and knock me to the ground. Luckily, I was able to get him on his back and get up. I saw my date grab a metal pipe from the van. She told me they had a gun, and to give them my money and truck, and I won't get hurt. Of course, with my I'm invincible mentality, I said no. She started to cry and saying they didn't want to hurt me. He then started to go back towards the car. At that point, I told them I was a cop, drew my concealed firearm, and to lay on the ground. After a moment of shock from all of us, they complied. I was able to call 911, tell them my name and badge number. I had 2 at gunpoint, and needed backup immediately. I gave our dispatcher the best directions I could to this field. While on the phone, they both fled. Again, stupid new cop young guy mentality. I chased them. I took off after the man, who ran into the woods around the field. I chased him for maybe 30 seconds and heard 3 loud pops and saw muzzle flash. My I'm invincible mentality went right out the window. I ran like hell back towards my car and peeled the hell out of there. I went back to the area I picked her up in, called dispatch again, and had officers come to that location. Of course, the first officers to pull up was my sergeant and my field training officer. Of course, they were both completely understanding and didn't give me any shit about it at all. The most used words were dumbass and stupid fucking rookie. I hopped in their car and went towards the field. Luckily, the van was still there. I was told to shut my mouth and only come out if they start getting shot at. They cleared the area and started looking in the van. They found meth right on the center console and searched the car. What scared me the most was when my field training officer and sergeant came back to the patrol car, let me out and told me to come look in the back of the van. Both of them were pale, looked horrified. I went to the back of the van, where there were several knives, duct tape, lighter fluid, a decent amount of rifle ammunition, handcuffs, and what looked to be dried blood. In the front seat passenger side, we found an AR-15 style rifle and 2 more handguns. We called for immediate backup and detectives. When they investigated the blood, it turned out it wasn't blood. The plates had been stolen, and the van was a reported stolen. I still get shit about the whole encounter, but luckily no one got hurt. I will never use online dating again. Ever. I live in a small city in Romania with a population of around 30,000. It's a quiet place with a tight-knit community, but it's not exactly the most welcoming place for someone like me. Romania isn't infamous for its hostility toward gay people, but the climate is far from accepting. There's an unspoken rule to keep your personal life private, especially if it veers from the traditional expectations of family and marriage. One evening, feeling a mix of boredom and hope, I opened Grindr. Most profiles on the app in my city are faceless, a flower, a landscape, or some vague symbol replacing the typical selfie. Mine wasn't much different. For many of us here, it's about safety. Among the profiles, one caught my eye, a drawing of a rose. He claimed to be 18, and our initial conversation flowed easily. He seemed kind, charming even. Eventually, after chatting for a while, we decided to exchange pictures. I sent him a selfie. In return, he sent a picture of a guy I had seen around town. He was undeniably cute, with a shy smile that immediately made my stomach flip. Recognizing him, I sent back a playful message. "Hey, I've seen you around the city. Didn't know you were gay too," laughing face. He didn't seem fazed, and our conversation continued. Soon, we agreed to meet. I had errands to run that day, specifically a trip to the tailor shop. My cousin's bachelorette party was just around the corner, and I needed to adjust my favorite shirt for the occasion. The tailor shop was located in a 4-story building. The ground floor housed a clothing store where my aunt worked. The first floor served as a storage room. The third floor was a barber's salon, and the tailor shop was at the top. I suggested we meet in front of the building. He agreed. As I walked to the tailor shop, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. After dropping off my shirt, I decided to stop by the clothing store on the ground floor to say hello to my aunt. We exchanged pleasantries, and as she stepped away to assist a customer, I glanced out the window. That's when I noticed them, 5 men, all in their late 20s, standing behind the building. None of them looked like the guy from the photo. Something about their body language felt off. My heart began to race as a sinking feeling washed over me. Trying to stay calm, I texted the guy, "Hey, did you make it to the tailor shop yet?" Seconds later, one of the 5 men's phones lit up. He glanced at it, typed something quickly, and moments later, I received a message on Grindr. "I'm behind the tailor shop. I went there to smoke so no one would see me. Come smoke with me." Panic set in. It was clear I wasn't meeting the guy from the picture. I felt trapped. Trying to keep my composure, I responded, "Why don't we meet on the side of the building instead? It's quieter there." My hope was to shift the situation to a place where I could observe them from a safer vantage point. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. I watched as all 5 men moved to the side of the building. My heart was pounding. As soon as I saw my chance, I slipped out the front door, keeping my head low, and ran as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was far from the building, my mind racing with fear and relief. That night, I deleted the conversation and blocked the profile. Grindr cutie? Let's not meet. The next day, something unexpected happened. While running errands downtown, I bumped into the guy from the picture. My heart skipped a beat. Feeling emboldened, I struck up a casual conversation. As we talked, I pretended to check my phone, opening Grindr just enough to let him see the app on my screen. His eyes widened slightly. After a moment, he leaned closer and asked, "You're, you know." I nodded, a bit hesitant but hopeful. "Yeah," I admitted. To my surprise, he smiled and said softly, "Me too." Relieved, I told him about the incident from the day before, how his picture had been used to lure me into what was likely a dangerous situation. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "That's really scary," he said, shaking his head. I had no idea someone was using my picture. We talked for a while, finding common ground in our shared experiences of navigating life in a city where being openly gay was a risk. There was a quiet understanding between us, an acknowledgement of the difficulties we faced, but also the small joys we could find in moments like this. Before we parted ways, I mustered the courage to ask him out. Maybe we could grab coffee or something when school starts. He smiled, that same shy smile from the photo that had first caught my attention. "I like that." As I walked away, a mix of emotions swirled within me. The memory of the scare from the day before lingered, but it was tempered by the hope of something new, something genuine. In a city that often felt stifling, moments like this reminded me that connection was still possible, even in the most unexpected ways. Later that evening, I sat in my room reflecting on everything. The incident was a stark reminder of the risks involved in being vulnerable in a place where trust was a luxury. But it also underscored the resilience required to seek out those moments of authenticity, to take chances in the face of fear. Meeting him, the real him, felt like a small victory. It wasn't just about finding someone who understood me, but about reclaiming a piece of myself in a world that often demanded I hide. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. I went on a Tinder date some time ago while I was adjusting to a new city I had moved to. I didn't really know anybody there, so I used some online dating apps to see the dating scene around town. I landed one from a girl that seemed just like an artsy hippie type of girl. We had a few exchanges through the Tinder app and then decided to meet up for a drink. I picked her up at her house, and she greeted me at the door and gave me a hug. She said the name of a local bar she wanted to go to for us to chat and get to know each other. I told her I would drive and proceeded to my car. The first red flag I noticed was when I walked to my car and opened the door. She had just followed me to the driver's side and was standing behind me staring. I looked at her blankly for about 15 seconds and asked her if she was going to get in. She said sure I would love to, and went the long way to the passenger side around the back of the car. Since I had just met the girl, I figured she had just maybe smoked some weed or something, as I had kind of got the vibe she was a bit of a stoner. As I was driving to the bar, she talked in a very low voice, almost as if she was trying to whisper. I am not hard of hearing or anything, but I had to ask her to repeat herself several times just so I could make out the full sentences she was saying. When we got to the bar, I made sure we got a seat closer to the back away from most people, just so I could have a little quiet in order to hear her. The conversations honestly carried on as normal from this point, and it was actually a fun time for the time being. We talked about different things we were interested in, and she did bring up she did recreationally use weed and a few other tripping substances, like shrooms and such. I am not much of a fan of these, but it at least made me relax in the back of my mind to think maybe she was just high off marijuana, and that rationally explained some of the out there behavior. Granted, I had a few drinks at this point, so I was honestly not thinking straight. I asked her if she wanted to go to my place after drinks, and she agreed. When we got to my place, we had a few more drinks. Then she started talking about her jewelry. This is where it gets weird. She told me her jewelry was her big secret, and it defined her. When I asked her why it was so important, she said, "I'm actually Anastasia, and I was never killed in Russia. My jewelry is my link to my past." It was hard for me to take that serious at this point with how much I drank, so I kind of challenged that statement using the little bit I knew about history. At this point she freaked out and started yelling at the top of her lungs about how I don't respect ancestors and history. Then she got quit and tiptoed right up to me and grabbed me by the neck. She then brought my face eye to eye with hers while still holding my neck. She says at this point, "I am a shaman and I will curse you. My ancestors have destroyed many people and you do not respect that. You are from oppressive ancestors and they will be punished." Then she put her hand in a whiskey glass and made a cross on my face and kissed my forehead. At this point, I started to sober up a little. I talked her into calming down, telling her I was only joking. Then she slowly started getting back to normal. Then, she started talking about her cat fetish. She tells me she has a list of people who she tames to act as cats. I am not about judging people on their fetishes, so I listen in. She then tells me all the things she does to them and starts acting like a cat in my living room. If she had not yelled at me earlier on, I might have almost been turned on by it. My red flags in my head were tingling like crazy at this point, so I just listened and tried not to set her off. She noticed sage on my kitchen counter and asked me to let her light it and bless the house. Side note, I use sage to make my house smell better occasionally. It's kind of a ritual I like to do, but it's mine and mine own, something I take very personally and like to do myself. I tell her no, she can't light it, and that it's my thing to do on my own. Then she freaks out telling me I am a horrible human being and screaming all over the place. I tell her I can take her home now, and she runs to the door and goes outside. As I get outside, she is screaming at the top of her lungs that I am a horrible person and I should go die. I tell her she can walk herself home then, and I go back to my place and lock the door. She then starts banging on the door hard in about 10 minutes, saying she left her phone in there. I grab her phone off the kitchen counter and open the door to hand it to her. She tries to barge inside, and I block her with my forearm. She then acts like she is about to punch me. I just hold my ground and tell her she is not coming in. She screams she wanted the whiskey bottle we were drinking from. I told her he'll know, because I paid for the damn thing. I slam the door at that point and lock it. I hear her bang on the door for a minute. I then hear her footsteps going down the stairs. I waited about an hour and then went walking outside to see if she was still hanging around. I didn't see her, nor did I ever see her again after that. I know this is probably not the scariest encounter ever, but for the next few nights I was creeped out always walking around the area I lived to make sure she wasn't hanging around. I honestly hope she is okay wherever she is, but I hope to never see her again. I just came out of a relationship and felt like a bit of casual dating will be fun, so I went on to Tinder. I made it clear to the few people I actually matched with and spoke to that I didn't want anything serious, just a dinner date or a pub night here and there. I matched with a really cute guy, let's call him Pete. He had just moved to my city, and also wasn't looking for anything serious. He just wanted to meet some people and see some local spots. The first night we met up at a well-known tapas bar. I chose this place because I had a few friends that were waitresses and bar staff there, so I felt safe meeting a stranger here. He was on time, we had nice chats, really cool guy on first impression. We spoke about work, to which he responded that he's a software developer, but he's just started his freelancing career. We spoke about where he stays now that he's moved up here, and he said that he's sharing a place with some friends. Rent is quite pricey in this city, so it made sense to me. He asked where I live, and I told him that I'm lucky to have my own one-bedroom apartment in quite a nice and popular part of town, mostly thanks to my parents that helped me save and gave me a portion of the deposit money for my 21st birthday, which I invested and grew until I had enough to put down a decent deposit. He then offered to drop me off at home, but I said no, I'd prefer to Uber home by myself. He asked if this was because I'm going to go meet someone else after him, and I laughed because I genuinely thought this was a joke. The next time I saw Pete was about 3 days later. He said he knew it was fast, but he actually couldn't stop thinking about me, and he wanted to see me again. This time we met at a different restaurant, also one I chose because I went to school with the owner and knew all the staff pretty well. The place is a little bit more pricey, and he got super annoyed with me for ordering as much as I did. I couldn't understand why, since I insisted on paying for my own stuff both times we met. That night, same story, let me drop you off at home, please. Again, I said no. While we're in the middle of this conversation, he gets a call. He stepped away, but I could still hear a fair amount. No, I think I'm gonna stay with you again. Yeah, I'm with her. Don't worry about it. Okay, I'll be home soon. So now I think he's chatting to his roommate or maybe his mom, but I don't ask. He comes back to our table. Please, I insist. Bad things happen to women that Uber home this late by themselves. I'd feel better if I dropped you off. Not having the energy to argue, I tell him fine, and I put my address into his GPS. As soon as he got home, he messages me and tells me he'll be picking me up in the morning to go for a picnic. I reply that I actually have cleaning to do, but again, he insists that he'll see me at 10. Come 10 a.m. that next morning, best believe he's right outside of my apartment. I get into his car, and as he leans over to kiss my cheek, I notice that his breath stinks. Obviously, I'm a little grossed out. We have our picnic, and it's quite nice. He tried to kiss me a few times, but I avoided it with everything in me. By about 4 p.m. I tell him that I really want to go home, and the park we went to is about an hour and a half drive from my apartment, so I couldn't really Uber back home because it would cost a fortune. He agrees it's time to go, so we get in his car and we're off. I fell asleep in the car on the drive back, and when I woke up he asked if we should finish the rest of the bubbly we got for mimosas up at my apartment. I said to him I don't want to, and he just snaps. He raised his voice and said something along the lines of, "What are you hiding from me? Just be honest. Why are you so desperate to keep me out of your apartment?" I was so confused I actually just kept quiet. He dropped me off, but I could see his car across from my apartment for about half an hour before he actually left. About 5 minutes after he left, he let me know that he's home safe, and he thinks he's starting to fall for me. So naturally I'm freaked out, because I made it clear that I didn't want anything serious, and he said he felt the same. I said to him if that's the case, I think we should take a break from hanging out with each other. About 5 days later he messages and asks if we can go for dinner again. He found an Indian cuisine place he knows I'll love. I tell him it's cool, he should just send me the address. He tells me that he'll pick me up. So 7 p.m. comes, he tells me he's downstairs, and as I go down to meet him, I see he's standing at my gate. I press the remote control to open the gate, and he walked inside to meet me. "Show me which one is yours. I'd love to see how you live." Not hi. Not how are you. That's his opening line. So now I'm naturally unsettled. I say to him that I'm starving. Could we go for dinner, and I'll show him my place at a later stage. At dinner he gets a call again. This time he didn't step away. "Pete, yeah. I don't know. I can let you know by about 10. He then turns to me, "Am I sleeping by you tonight?" Me, no. I don't know. I have work tomorrow. Pete to me. "Yes, me too," then back to the caller. "I'll let you know, okay, caller." "No, you're not. Can you just get your things, please?" Pete. "And do what with them?" Caller. "Take them to that girl you're seeing." I'm done asking you. Now I'm sitting here in absolute shock and terror. What in the fuck is going on here? Our food arrives, and we barely speak. I say to him, "Why did you ask me if you can sleep over by me? We're not spending time together like that. You know this." He then spins this story about how he just wants to hang out and again see how I live. I then say to him, very frankly, that I don't like having strangers in my apartment. He gets very touched, and the bill arrives. As per usual, I pay for myself, he pays for himself. I say to him I'll get an Uber home, and he says, "What's the use? I already know where you live. Let me drop you off." By now I've already decided that this will be the last time I see him. I get into his car, and I reach for my jumper that I threw in the back when he fetched me. I notice a bag in the back of the car, full of clothes and toiletries, as well as a pillow. I don't think much of it. I don't personally drive or own a car, but I know my sister always has the most random shit on the back seat of her car. On the way home he's dead quiet, when suddenly he says, "Do you know how selfish you are? I've had no issue driving you around, but you don't want me to sleep over by you." I say to him that I've never had an issue with Ubering, and if he's so touched, I also have no issue with paying him what the Ubers would have cost me. I'm over this, and I'm not even playing nice anymore. His phone rings again. "Caller, your stuff is at the security boom at the gate, Pete. Stay with your girlfriend, or stay with your mom. You're fucked for taking advantage of everyone like this, Pete. I don't speak to my mom, you know this, you bitch," and then hangs up. Now I think this is maybe an ex-girlfriend that he needs to collect things from. Before I've even had a chance to process what happened, he turns to me and starts yelling at me. I have nowhere to go. Are you fucking happy? You spoiled brat. Living off mommy and daddy's money. Getting driven around by me like I fucking work for you, bitch. My whole body got stiff with fear. I don't know if I'm going to cry or throw up. In my head I'm just planning how I'm going to grab my bag the second he stops and run straight to the cafe under my apartment. If you run through the cafe, you can get to a gate that takes you to the back part of my apartment, and it works with fingerprint atches. There wasn't time to still find my keys in my bag, and I didn't want the main gate I normally use to open wide enough for him to get in when I go in. He stops at my apartment, and as planned, I jump out, run into the cafe, run out the back, through the little gate, up to the second floor. My apartment was on the 4th floor, and I hammered on a neighbor's door. I went inside and told her and her husband everything that happened, and asked if they would mind calling the cafe to explain why I ran through with no explanation and in such a state. I blocked Pete, and I haven't seen him since. I'm still not sure what his case was. From what I gathered, he was basically homeless, and I think he wanted to get into my apartment to maybe sleep over there for a while. I'm not sure if the girl that kept calling him was also a Tinder date that let her into his apartment, and he just never left. All I know is that he scared the living daylights out of me, and I never ever want to see him again. So I had just gotten out of a pretty significant relationship with someone of 4 years, nearly engaged and moving in together, etc., when things fell apart. I took a good amount of time to be on my own and get my shit together again, when my friends began encouraging me to get back out there. Needless to say, I really wasn't wanting anything at that point, nor looking for anything, but they insisted that I at least just go out on a few casual dates, for practice, just to kind of get my skills back up for when I was ready. I think they were honestly just worried, because I had become quite hermetic. So I matched with this girl, who's home from college for the summer. She's a little out of the way from me, but was eager to meet, seemed really interested, was even willing to come to my area, etc. I really wasn't all that interested, to be truthful, but my friends again encouraged this, practice, whatever that means. A date doesn't mean commitment. Whatever. I want to be very clear, though, that I was extremely honest and explicit with her that I was not looking for anything serious, or anything really at all. I was very forthcoming that I had gotten out of something serious, and I was just kind of encouraged to explore. She persisted and still wanted to meet, so we agreed to a casual lunch in a sports bar that week. I get there, and she was already waiting for me. I was a bit put off by how much different she looked than her pictures. Not trying to sound shallow or anything, but her pics from Tinder easily had to be at least 5 years old, which I verified based on tattoos she had in person, versus ones she didn't in pics. So I was a bit thrown off by that. I wasn't the least bit attracted to her, but I was there to just have new experiences anyway, right? No big deal. I felt so bad, because the entire time she seemed so incredibly shy and awkward. I even noticed her hand shaking when she reached for her glass, which I found endearing, honestly. So I did my best to get her talking, and try to help her feel more relaxed. I asked her questions, and chatted about things I figured you chat about on dates. Where she grew up, music she's into, school she goes to, major, etc. All to which I literally received one-word answers. It went on like this for about an hour, and she was just not working with me at all. But I tried to keep room in my heart, because it was clear she was feeling anxious, and I understand that on a personal level. Then she pulls out this book and says, "I got this for you." And I responded very grateful, thanking her, and inquiring what it was about, 'cause hey, if someone wants to share a good read with me, I'm all for that. She looks at me funny and says in a very sudden, but odd tone, "You're kidding, right?" I'm very confused, and just kind of look at her like... And she says, "This is your favorite book. You told me this was your favorite book." To which I said, "No? I have never even heard of this before," so we concluded that she ultimately got me confused with someone else she must have been chatting, which I honestly found hilarious, lol. She was embarrassed, but I made light of it and said I found it funny, 'cause I get it, that's Tinder culture, I guess. So as we finished lunch, and I'm still receiving one-word answers despite our funny moment, I kind of become a bit suggestive that we should conclude our date by saying I had to get back to feed my animals and do some laundry, etc. But she became very adamant on spending more time, and asked if we could do something else. I was genuinely trying to be a decent person, so I agreed, and we found a nearby park to walk. That's where shit gets weird. We sat on a park bench, mind you it's broad daylight. There's kids playing basketball nearby, folks jogging past. I start trying to make conversation yet again, but still get the one-word answers. Then out of seemingly nowhere, without any warning whatsoever, she proceeds to just kiss me really aggressively, tongue, and everything. I was honestly just so shocked I stood there frozen, not knowing what the fuck to do. I had this timid, shy woman, who's really not made much conversation with me at all, who was so nervous she was visibly shaking, just turn into a freaking bear mauling my face in like 0.6 seconds. My head was spinning with confusion and anxiety, and I swear it felt like it lasted forever, and I just prayed for it to stop. I was so put off and honestly a bit afraid to do or say anything. Like, what do you even do in that situation? I was just hoping she'd pick up on my very obvious body language, that I wasn't reciprocating anything at all. I was completely unprepared for a situation like this. Then some really nasty guy walks by, gawking and catcalling, and literally begins propositioning us into a three-way. And I'm just like, what the fuck is going on? I need to get out of here. I was 1,000 different types of uncomfortable. I end up managing to ward him off after telling him very politely, no more than several times. All the while she's just laughing. And I'm thinking, who even are you? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde over here, WTF. So he leaves, and I'm insisting now that I need to leave and go home. She seems to ignore what I'm saying, and gets very close to my face again and says, "Did you like that? Do you think I'm sexy? Do you want me?" When I tell you I was so fucking nervous. I was like, I really need to get home. And she was like, "Can I come?" And I told her very firmly no. She literally tried to persuade me to let her come back to my place with me, and I had to say no more than 3 times. So finally I'm home, and frankly just kind of shaken up. I hadn't really done the dating thing in quite a long time, but that felt very abnormal. She then texts me after she gets home, and asks me out on a second date. And I was very kind, despite being made incredibly uncomfortable, and I told her I thought she was a very cool chick, and I had a nice time, but that I did not feel anything there, and reminded her I wasn't looking for anything. She then text-bombed me a bunch of crazy shit, saying how she didn't understand and was so confused, that she thought I was so into her, and that things went great. I did not respond to any of these because now she's continuing to cross my boundaries. I said what I needed to say, and I thought I was being decent by at least being honest. So the texts continued, and I figure they're going to eventually stop because it was a first date. How can someone be so upset over someone not reciprocating on a first date? They did not stop. By the texts, you would have thought we just ended a 2-year relationship. Then she began calling, at which point I had to block her number. So Nightmare Tinder girl, please. For the love of everything, let's never, ever, meet again. This happened about a year ago. I was on Grindr looking for either fun dates or new friendships. For those of you unfamiliar with Grindr, it's a social media app that is designed primarily for gay men, and many people use it to hook up with other men. One day, I was scrolling, and I received a new message from a guy who we'll call Brian. I took a look at some of his profile pictures, read his bio, and decided that I was interested in him. We started messages back and forth, and he seemed to be a really kind, charismatic guy who really knew how to hold a conversation, something that is very hard to come by on the app. A few days went by, and we eventually exchanged numbers. He seemed nice enough, and I wanted to see if he was as great in person as he was over text message. So I asked him if he wanted to go on a date with me. He very happily agreed. So I scheduled a date with him. The plan was that I was going to drive to his place, pick him up, and we'd grab some lattes at my favorite local coffee shop. It was around 6 p.m., and I sent him a text message to tell him that I was leaving my house, to which he responded with a quaint, "I can't wait to meet you." I smiled at his supposed kindness. Then, in the middle of driving to his house, I received a phone call from him, so I picked up, and the conversation went mostly as follows. Me: "Hey Brian, what's up?" Brian: "Hey, quick change of plans. I'm feeling tired, and I would rather not go out. Would you be okay with staying at my place? We can watch some shows and order some takeout." Me: "That's not what I really had in mind. I like to go out and do things on the first date." Brian: "Oh, don't be such a buzzkill. Just come over. I won't show you a bad time." As he spoke on the phone, I got a really strange feeling in my gut. Like something was wrong about how he talked to me. Before I met him, I imagined his voice and inflections to sound a lot more lighthearted, because the way we texted was very whimsical and fun. But over the phone, he talked as if he was in a hurry. Perhaps slightly frantic. However, despite my gut feeling, I decided that I would accept his offer. Maybe he was just tired or stressed from the workday. I pulled into his driveway, and he greeted me at his door. He looked like his picture, and he was very handsome. He was wearing fashionable glasses, and his dark hair, straight hair contrasted with his light skin. When we go inside, I was greeted by one of his roommates, who was playing Dark Souls in the living room. I wanted to be polite, so I approached the roommate and introduced myself. I didn't want to come off as rude to Brian in case this date ended up going really well. While I'm talking with his roommate, Brian calls my name and beckons me to walk inside his bedroom. I politely excuse myself and follow Brian into his room. When I walked inside, I saw something straight out of a fucking /no sleep story. Only this was real and right in front of me. There were candles lit all around, and when I got a closer look, I noticed that there were several altars scattered across the room. Effigies of ancient-looking figures, animal bones, jars with unidentifiable liquids inside, some sort of dagger next to a cat's skull. The whole shebang. I don't remember all the altars, but I do remember a couple. One of them was on the floor, and there was a glass container that held some kind of yellow liquid with animal skulls surrounding the container. Another altar was on a shelf next to his bed, and this one had a few candles surrounding some kind of doll with its eyes sewn shut and its hands missing. Now that one was creepy and super bizarre. A part of me was telling me to nope the fuck out of there immediately, but I thought that maybe I was overreacting to someone's religious choices. I didn't know much about cult religions, so I didn't want to assume that this guy had any kind of malintent. Plus, I can be a little reactive at times, so I decided to stay and go along with the ride. When we walked into his room, I wanted to calm my nerves, and because I have a really curious mind, I decided to ask Brian about what these altars were for. He told me that he'd tell me about them later. A weird response, but again, I brushed it off my shoulders thinking that he might just be a bit eccentric. I can be a little weird too, so I tried to be empathetic and understanding. Then, I point to one of the altars and ask about it. He frowns at me and scowls. "Don't touch that." His voice startled me. His intense inflections paired with his angry expression sent a lump straight to my throat, and I felt threatened. I was almost 4 feet away from the altar, not even close to touching it, and yet he just yelled at me like a father yelling at his kid to stop messing around at church. I was confused, and thinking I had done something wrong, I apologized. In the blink of an eye, his scowl turned into a smile, and he kindly invited me to sit with him to watch a show. What really weirded me out was the fact that his smile looked and felt genuine. He had just gotten angry, but all of a sudden, he didn't care and served me up a really kind disposition. I was unsure of how to process what had just happened, so I just decided to sit down with him. He seemed to be acting pretty normal once this ordeal had happened, and we started to talk about ourselves. After some time, he became really sweet and soft-spoken, similar to how he was over text message, and we were able to share some stories about our lives. It was starting to feel like an actual first date, and my nerves subsided a bit. I was probably just overthinking everything else. He then turns on his TV. Now, mind you, I was still a little freaked out by his random outbursts, so I was on guard. So, I offered to invite his roommate to come and hang out with us. Brian's roommate seemed like any old average Joe when I met him, and I just wanted someone else to be there to act as a buffer. I wanted to see how he would act around other people, but when I gave him my idea, he immediately shut me down, and his personality switched from easygoing to stressed and angry. He started cussing out his roommate to me, making it clear that he absolutely hated him. The switch was so jarring, I started to panic again. Then he changed the subject and started to talk about me. He said that he found me really attractive, and in the process, his fingers started to graze my thighs. I needed a second to collect myself, though, so I excused myself to get some water. When I stood up, he immediately slapped my ass and told me not to take too long. I walked out, closed the door behind me, and started to make my way for the kitchen. I was hoping to chat with his roommate on the way, and see if I could ask him about Brian. But he was asleep on the living room couch, so I just made a beeline to the cabinets in search of a cup. I thought about walking out and driving home, because I didn't appreciate his sudden touchiness, but I started getting paranoid. He had all those altars, and he didn't tell me what the altars were for. I've seen some horror films about the occult, and I truly had no idea what this guy was capable. Yeah, he was sweet at times, but he was showing me some really aggressive behavior. Who's to say that this guy isn't able to put some kind of voodoo curse on me? Dramatic, I know, but you can never really be sure. So I grabbed my water and cautiously head back to his room. When I walked back inside, I saw him sitting on the couch with his legs crisscrossed and his eyes closed. When I approached him, I saw his mouth moving, but I didn't hear anything coming from it. Weirded out by this, I called his name, but he didn't respond. Strange. I called his name a second time, and he opened his eyes, uncrossed his legs, and went back to watching the TV without at all addressing what he was doing. What the fuck? I was getting really worried, but I did what I could to keep my cool. I didn't want to do anything to upset him or make him lose his cool. I sat next to him on the couch, and we start talking. Once again, he was completely normal. Unnervingly normal. It's like I was in the room with a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, except Brian was able to switch between them seamlessly. I needed to do something, but what the fuck was I supposed to do? I couldn't call him out, because he might lash out in some malicious way. But I also didn't want to stay because he was freaking me the hell out. I just stay, and I tried to devise some kind of plan to get out of there without making him angry. At some point, he gets up to grab his phone, and I thought I would try dishing out the same kind of ass grab that he gave to me when I went to get water. Maybe it would release the tension that I was feeling. Maybe he'd like it, and it'd make him less aggressive. Regardless, I wanted to try something. I made my move and give him a cheeky-ass grab. Immediately, he turned around, swatted my hand away, and lunged at me. He had his hand curled up in a fist, and he flung it towards my face. His fist was inches away from making a connection with my right cheek, but he stopped mid-punch. In that moment, I saw that his eyes were wide open, and his facial expression was cold and emotionless. He was right in my face. My heart was beating so fast that I felt like I was seconds away from an aneurysm. He was looking directly at me, and my eyes stared back. At that moment, I felt like the prey to his predator. Then he uncurled his fist, put his icy hands on both sides of my face, and started to squeeze. "You're just so cute." He pulled me in and forced a kiss. I absolutely did not want to kiss him, but I was paralyzed and couldn't will myself to push him away. His words were patronizing, sort of like he was talking to a dog, and it felt even more like this because he had just scrunched my face against his. I felt disgusting kissing someone who had almost punched me in the face, but there was nothing I could do in that moment. Again, I didn't want to risk pissing him off. He slowly pulled away, gave me another sweet smile, and sat down, pretending that nothing had just happened. Just started staring at the TV. Yep, I'm over this completely. His behavior was becoming more erratic and more unpredictable. His room was fucking creepy as shit. He clearly had associations with the occult, and frankly, he was scaring me. I eventually decided that I'd rather deal with the voodoo-looking altars later than stay in his house, and have to put up with the immediate danger. So I snapped myself out of my anxiety-induced trance, stood up, and told him that I was starting to get sick and that I wanted to go home. He got angry and tried to convince me to stay the night, but I gathered my courage and insisted that it was time for me to leave. He begrudgingly let me, but it was clear that my decision pissed him off. I didn't care anymore. I said my goodbyes and told him that I'd text him later, thinking, fuck that, to myself while doing so. I got in my car and drove home shaking and sweating. I felt relieved to get out of there, but nervous that he might try to do something. The uncertainty of it all is what truly shakes me up, but thankfully, no actual harm came to me. Who knows what would have happened if I had stayed, though. I blocked Brian's number as well as his Grindr profile, and even now, I keep my own Grindr pictures private. I haven't heard from him since, but I still fear that he's going to try and come after me somehow. To Brian the erratic occultist, let's never meet again. This happened 3 summers ago, but I remember the main events. To preface this, I have been on a shocking amount of dates and put myself in many foolish situations in the past. I am a female, and I was 25 at the time, if it matters. It started on the POF app. I came across a cute guy. He was my type physically, kind of nerdy looking. On his profile, he had very adventurous photos of him hiking and traveling. He seemed really exciting to get to know. Once he saw I looked at his profile, he sent me a message. We flirted a bit back and forth and exchanged numbers, even though he lived about an hour away. He said on the app he's never been to my city and didn't plan on it, so we probably wouldn't meet. I respected his honesty. I don't like wasting my time. One day shortly after meeting him, online he texted me randomly saying he's in my town on some work thing and invited me to a bar he was at. I decided to meet up since I was already in the area. He said he would pick me up. I was dumb and agreed, even though it was just over 4 blocks away. It took him way longer than it should have to get to me, and I honestly don't think he was actually ever at the bar. Once in POF Date's car, I noticed it was a rental, and that it seemed like he had just gotten his license because he was a terrible driver. After driving in circles, he told me to pick a place, but not in the area, because parking is impossible. I picked a place 15 minutes away by car with lots of parking, but also a busy place since I was with a stranger. Once there, he started pressuring me to drink. He insisted. I'm not a huge drinker, but I enjoy pub-style bars. I caved and had a drink, and was again pressured to have another one. He was very pushy and seemed really irritated that I wasn't going for it. Usually I'd end a date pretty quickly if being mistreated, but he became charming enough to keep me there at least until we were done our date. I saw an old acquaintance at the bar and wanted my date to know I knew him. In my head, I think I wanted my date to know that someone could identify him. I'm not a paranoid person, but I think my subconscious was on alert. After an hour talking in the bar, I tell him I'm ready to head out. He insisted we go across the road to get coffee. At the time it seemed strange to me. Neither of us had much to drink and didn't need to sober up. Coffee seems like an odd choice otherwise. I entertained it. Once there, we sipped our drinks. He told me he rented a beautiful Airbnb in a nearby neighborhood that is more out of the city/country. He told me he had it all to himself and invited me going on about how nice it is. I kept politely saying no and throwing around different excuses, which he would counter with a reason for me to come. With no intention of going, I agreed, but only if he would drive me home to get overnight things. I felt he wasn't going to let me say no. He seemed happy with that answer, so we headed out. While driving in the direction of my place, he said instead he would stop at a 7-Eleven and grab me travel-sized toiletries, so I wouldn't need anything. I felt panicked because my plan was not to go with him. Something about him was off, and I felt stupid for even getting back in his car to begin with. He turned his car, and we were then headed toward the more country area. Literally, there aren't any 7/11s or open stores in the middle of nowhere. Then I mentioned that I'm actually thinking I'd prefer not to stay with him and asked to be brought home. He then said something that made me completely nervous to be around him for much longer. He said he's sharing the Airbnb with the owners and said they are really fun and sweet and that they drink and play games together. He originally said he had it all to himself. I knew I didn't want to make it obvious that I was catching on to his lie, so I went along with it and said, "Oh, I have to wear my cute fluffy overnight PJs instead of my date dress because I'll be way more comfy." Then I spewed off a few other things. I mentioned that I need my medication and absolutely can't miss a dose. Surprisingly, he turned around, and as we drove back into the city, I felt a bit more calm, but at that point, not safe. Finally, we got close to my place. I had no intention of letting him close enough to know where I live. He was mentioning that he was going to come up to my apartment once we got there, and that is just a huge hell no. I don't know what I would do, but I looked for any opportunity to get out of the situation, knowing he could turn around and take me somewhere private in the matter of 15 minutes if he wanted. We got to a stop sign where people were crossing, thank God. I quickly but calmly got out and said, I think I have a headache. I'll text you." I closed the car door and went through a public park which was beside a building that his car wouldn't be able to drive into. I looked back to make sure he wasn't getting out of his car/following, and I could see him staring at me. He was so furious I have chills thinking about it. Within the hour, he had blocked me on POF. Looking back, I think he possibly wanted to get me a coffee to possibly put something in it. I think he told me on POF that we would never meet to maybe cover his ass. And I know he did not have good intentions with me. Since then I have met my fiancée on POF, and was super careful about dating up until then, making sure the first few dates are very public and to arrange my own transportation. Hey, I stumbled on this subreddit recently, and it put me in mind of an old story. This happened about 15 years ago. At the time, I was dating around and I had a few creepy encounters during that time, but this guy takes the cake. He was an acquaintance my brother had met at a bar a few times and was showing around the local area because he was new to the country. My brother set us up because he was apparently desperate for a girlfriend, and I guess I was pretty desperate too, because we went on a date together. That date was probably the worst first date I've ever been on. I showed up to the restaurant we were meeting at. He was late, which isn't a huge deal, so I let it slip and we went to sit down. To be honest, I knew from the start I wasn't really attracted to him, but I thought I would be polite and see if we had a nice night. He started off politely too. He held the door for me, pulled my seat out. It wasn't really necessary, but it was nice anyway. Then, when we were sitting down waiting for someone to come and take our orders, I was reading the menu, and he started talking about how much his fiancée would have liked this place. That took me by surprise, and naturally I asked about his fiancée. He revealed that he had had a fiancée before moving over her, but he had just left her to move to another country. I asked why they had broken up, and he said they never really broke up as such, but he got fed up of her nagging him about various things and just moved away. I really didn't know what to say after that, so I changed the subject and started asking him more about himself and where he used to live. He wasn't really very forthcoming. Eventually, our waiter turned up and started talking to us. To clarify for the next part, our waiter was a man of color, and he had an unusual accent for our area. So my date stares blankly at him for a while, then turns to me and says, "You understand this guy?" I said that yes, I could understand him, before telling him our orders. After he left, my lovely date continued to shock me. He said, "I wouldn't normally leave ordering to the lady, but that brown guy talked really weirdly, and I didn't get it." Wow, way to tell me you're a racist and a sexist in one breath, dude. Again, I was speechless for a few moments before I got angry with him. I don't remember exactly what I said. It was something along the lines of, "Well, I'm not a lady, so I can order for myself just fine, thanks. And why make racial remarks?" Then he got annoyed with me and told me he wasn't being racist. He just wasn't used to that kind of person where he was from. I pointed out that he wouldn't have met me if he just stuck to people he was used to in his own country. He did calm down then and told me he wouldn't want that because he's glad he met me. Honestly, I found that a little weird, given that I didn't see any way to say that this date was going well, and he didn't know me very well at all. But I decided since we had ordered, I should stay, get my meal and try to redeem the evening before I leave and never see this man ever again. So I answered some of his questions about me, basic getting to know me and small talk stuff for the most part, then started on about my previous dates, if I was a virgin, whether I would be willing to wait until marriage, and then be submissive to my husband or not. It was at this point I realized that I was most likely on a date with a religious bigot, hence the misogyny, weird attitude to sexual stuff, and all his other closed-minded bullshit. So I settled for a none of your business, now I need to leave. I checked the prices on the menu and left money for my half of the food, plus a tip, on the table, and got up to leave. He said he didn't see why I was being unreasonable with him, as though this had been a normal date, but then told me that I couldn't expect him to take my money, because that was an insult to him. Fine, dude, you want to pay for a meal that's not getting eaten, you pay for it. I'm not that mad about spending my money that I'll stop you. So I took my money back and walked straight out. I just assumed that, yes, it was an awful evening, but I wouldn't have to see him again. I wasn't even back to my house when my brother started texting me, asking where I was because my date had called him in tears saying I had gone off for no reason, and he didn't know where I was or what to do. Thankfully, my brother was pretty calm about it and assumed that I had left for a reason. I explained everything to him, and he was pretty surprised too. After that night, we both tried to cut contact. My brother stopped meeting up with the guy, and we both blocked the Facebook account we had had for him too. My brother also blocked his number because he would not stop texting him asking about me, alternating between being really worried about me to saying he hoped I dropped dead. Then he started making endless different accounts on social media to harass us. He told my brother he didn't know why we weren't talking to him. He posted a bunch of weird posts describing me in detail before going on to call me a lot of horrible names. We kept blocking them and moving on. Then the harassment got worse. He either found me and followed me at some point, or got my address from a friend and turned up one day, standing around outside my house, asking to come in and speak to me. When I refused to let him in, he grabbed my arm to prevent me from going in either, and started to tell me that he didn't want to let me go because I would never find a man who would love me like he did, and that if I walked away from him again, I would regret it one day when I was old and lonely. He went on and on like this for ages and ages while I tried to pull my arm away from him, before I got fed up of this and yelled at him to get off me and leave me alone, then kicked him in the shin. He let go of my arm but cursed at me and said I was being ungrateful to him, but I took my opportunity to run inside and lock my door. He started banging on my door, then trying to push it inwards. I was getting both upset by this man and just super fed up of his presence in my life, so I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them that someone was trying to get into my house. I was told someone would be with me soon, but 20 to 30 minutes later there was no sign of them anywhere, and I was getting quite upset because this man was forcing my door, and I thought the lock was going to break soon. So I called my brother, who lives nearby, just because I knew he would come, even though I wasn't sure if he would be able to help much. About 15 minutes later, my brother turns up, and after a brief conversation I didn't quite hear outside, the pressure was gone off the door. I waited a few minutes and then texted my brother to see what was going on, and if it would be alright to look outside now. He didn't reply, and the next thing I heard was the police turning up. I went out to see what was going on. Apparently after my initial call, they had received another call from a neighbor saying there were two men fighting on my lawn. I guess this was my brother and the guy, since my brother looked out of breath and pretty shook up, and the guy wasn't around anymore. My brother explained to the police that he had tried to stop the man getting into my house, and then the man had hit him. I told my side of the story, and some of my other neighbors were asked what they had seen, and were able to tell them about his attempts to get in. Plus there were marks on the outer side of the door where he had tried repeatedly to get in. The police went to look for him, and a few weeks afterward I was called and told they thought they had found him, but when they wanted me to look at the suspected person, it wasn't the same man. I didn't hear anything else, and I don't know what happened to him. I didn't see him again, and so I'm probably safe after 15 years. Regardless, I don't ever want to see him again. About 5 or so years ago, I was 23 at the time and had just gotten out of my first and only serious relationship a year prior. That guy was my first love and my first sexual experience, and so needless to say, when things ended and he had zero interest in trying to work things out, I was heartbroken. After about a year of moping and being stupidly sexually promiscuous, I decided to try actual dating. I met this guy Rick on a dating website. He was a couple of years older than me, was an ex-Marine, was cute, and good at making conversation. After a few days of talking online, he asked for my number, and we decided to meet up. I drove to his house, and come to find out he lived with a few other guys who looked really shady. Now he actually lived in a good neighborhood, but the way they kept their home and the way his roommates looked was my first red flag that an inexperienced, naive girl would not fit in his crowd, but I decided to stay and give it a chance. Once he saw me, he came up, gave me a hug, and handed me a helmet. To his motorcycle. Now I have never in my life rode a motorcycle before, but I had always wanted to, so I thought why not and hopped on. Now the street he decides to take me up is known to be a very long and windy road that is pretty secluded. It's also important to note that this is the springtime, and it's about 5 p.m. when we go on our ride. I didn't realize at the time he had decided to take me on that specific road, but once we got on it, my red flag started to kick in. I began to realize that 1, it is dead silent and there are no other cars on this road right now. 2, it's starting to get dark, and 3, yeah, I don't know this guy, so what the hell am I doing? And my alarm bells start ringing. Now I will say that while I made a ton of mistakes within this story, this instance is where I am proud of how I reacted. Once my anxiety kicked in, I told him that I think we should turn around and go home. He started laughing and asked if I was scared, and I said no, I just need to head home, because my parents are expecting me for dinner soon. He kept riding forward. More alarm bells ringing. Pictures of me being raped and lying dead in a ditch came up. I kept asking him, can we please turn back, can we please turn back, and he finally gave in and turned around. The next day comes, and I told myself that maybe I was just overreacting, and he was harmless, and decided to agree on a second date a few days later. We met up at a sports bar for dinner and a couple of beers, so we can watch the hockey game. The entire time we are sitting there, Rick has his arm around me and has me literally attached to his hip, constantly trying to make out with me, and is acting extremely possessive. At this point I'm completely freaked out because I barely know this guy, and all he is talking to me is about our future, and how he would be such a protective boyfriend because he was an ex-Marine. At this point I knew I was done with him, but unfortunately my car is at his house. When we are done and head home, he insists that I come inside and hang out for a bit. I decide to walk in and stay for 5 minutes. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. We walk into his room, and he immediately pounces on me, making out with me and trying to feel me up. I kept pushing his hands away and kept telling him that I needed to get going, but I could tell he wasn't going to give up until he got what he wanted, especially after I realized his little friend was aroused. He told me that he would not let me leave until we did something. I had no idea what he would have forced me to do if I kept rejecting his advances, so I decided that my only way out of there was to finish him off. So I did, and the entire time I'm trying to act like I'm enjoying it while dying inside and hoping he would hurry up and finish so I can quickly leave. Luckily I only used my hands, and luckily it took him a few minutes to finish before I literally ran out that door and sped home. After that night he tried to ask me to hang out again, and I told him that I think it would be best if we stayed friends. This guy began to relentlessly call me and text me and beg me to see him, then proceeded to call me a bitch because I was ignoring him, then would apologize for calling me a bitch, and it was because he liked me so much. So I blocked him. Then he tried to message me on Instagram, so I blocked him there, and then on Facebook, and finally on Snapchat. During my freshman year of university, about 4 years ago, I was quite tired and lonely because I didn't make many friends and my 2 majors were pretty overwhelming. To pass time, I was browsing Reddit quite often. I even submitted an ad to find people to talk to. I got several responses, mostly from the US, though one was from my European country. It surprised me a bit, since not many people from there even know what Reddit is, but I was also glad I met someone local. This guy seemed cool. He worked for a global IT firm and played the piano, just like me. We talked, we exchanged a few emails, and it felt nice. Then one day he told me that if I pass my last exam we'll have a date. Quite pushy, right? I didn't want a date, TBH, but I wanted to meet him. So when I left the exam hall and was sitting on a train home, I recalled his offer. He said he'd be in my hometown that day. First I got home and tried to dress properly. I suddenly started to feel weak. I had a huge heartache and I had to rest for a moment. I called a guy and told him I'd be a bit late. Then he said something like, "But don't think that it'll be a date." Well, he didn't say it, he rather screamed it. "Okay." I promised I'd be there, so I arrived at the place and I saw him eating a dinner. Alone. I sat next to him and he didn't even bother asking me what I want. He was cold, just like this February day. Ironic and not nice at all. He simply said that I ruined his day by being 30 minutes late and that there is not future for us. Then I realized how snobbish he was. Though being a relatively nice person, I tried to make this evening better. I asked him if he wants to go to the cinema, museum, church, whatever. He said no. He only wanted to get to the train station. Remote train station that is not a main one. We started to walk towards the station. It was dark, wintry, and our path wasn't lit at all. My high heels were covered in mud, and I didn't really like it. We didn't talk at all, because we were fed up with each other, so when we reached the station I was relieved. I said goodbye and then he kissed me on my forehead. What the hell? Then I felt a bit better. A bit, because I had to get to the bus station on the other side of town. I had to take the same road we walked, and it gave me chills. I was walking for a while when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey miss." I turned around and saw 3 guys wearing hoodies. I started to walk faster and didn't answer. "Hey miss, you lost something." I heard again, but I didn't turn this time. I didn't lose anything. "No way. Miss, wait." I heard again and I sprinted shouting, "No." I agree, it was strange. And difficult. High heels are not racing shoes by any means. They started to run after me. You don't even know how scared I was. At least I was close to better lit area. I saw a tram station and an older woman standing there. I rushed there and approached her. Then I saw these 3 men standing on the other side of the road. I know they were waiting for me. I called my friend who lived near. He said he was in dorms, but he'd get there ASAP. I was shaking, being watched by these 3 guys. I realized one was holding something glowing in the dark. Was it a knife? I don't think I want to know. My friend arrived. He's quite a big man. He tried to chase these guys, but they disappeared in the dark. He took me to the other train station building. We were sitting there for a while. I was trembling and crying, and he was holding my hand all the time. Then he gave me money for a cab, and I went home. My parents weren't happy about this. They said it was my fault. Was it really? I hope I'll never meet these men again. And you, my date. Well, I don't want to ruin your day again. I think my favorite story is how I was dating a guy for about 5 months. It wasn't serious, but it wasn't casual either. Somewhere in that liminal space where you're not defining the relationship, but also not seeing anyone else. We texted every day, met up regularly, and things seemed to be going well. Or so I thought. One day, I texted him asking if he wanted to come over for dinner. It was a pretty normal thing for us to do. We'd cook together sometimes, or I'd make something while he lounged on the couch, scrolling through his phone or telling me about his day. This time, though, he didn't respond. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was busy or his phone had died. But as the hours ticked by, I started to get that uneasy feeling. You know, the one where the silence becomes heavy, like it's carrying a message you're not ready to hear. The next day, I woke up to find he still hadn't replied. I tried not to overthink it. I figured I'd give him space, let him reach out when he was ready. I've always prided myself on not being that person, the one who double texts or spirals into anxiety over a delayed reply. So I waited. That's when I saw it, a picture he posted on Instagram. It was a gorgeous shot of Venice Beach, the kind you'd see on a postcard. The caption read something cheesy like chasing dreams, embracing the sun. My heart sank. LA? What was he doing in LA? My confusion quickly turned into a gnawing curiosity. I texted him, trying to keep it casual. Hey, what's going on? What are you doing in LA? It took him a while to respond, but when he finally did, it felt like a punch to the gut. I moved to LA, he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No explanation, no apology, just a flat declaration. I stared at my phone, trying to process what I was reading. He moved? Across the country? Without telling me? I typed back, wait, what? You moved? When? Why didn't you say anything? His reply came quickly this time. Yeah, sorry. I've been thinking about it for a while. Wanted to pursue modeling, and thought it was time for a change. Just like that, 5 months of dating boiled down to a few curt sentences. No proper goodbye, no face-to-face conversation. His idea of breaking up with me was moving across the country and ghosting me. I couldn't believe it. Who does that? At first, I was hurt. I mean, how could I not be? I'd invested time and energy into this person, only for them to vanish without so much as a conversation. But then, as the days passed, the hurt started to morph into something else, disbelief and eventually humor. The sheer absurdity of it all began to dawn on me. I mean, who dumps someone by literally relocating to a different time zone? And then there was the kicker. About a year later, I'm scrolling through social media, and what do I find? A post from him, back in St. Louis, living with his parents. Turns out, the modeling career didn't pan out. All those dreams of chasing the sun and becoming the next big thing in LA ended with him back where he started, probably sleeping in his childhood bedroom. While in college, I met a guy through my best friend. She assured me he had a good heart, which, in hindsight, should have been my first red flag. But he was tall, cute, and seemed genuinely interested in me. When he asked me out, I thought, why not? A date sounded fun, and I was looking forward to getting to know him better. For the date, he suggested we meet at his house to watch a movie. This was before Netflix and chill became a euphemism, so I took it at face value. Watching a movie actually meant watching a movie. When I got to his place, he greeted me warmly and led me to his car. Before heading to Blockbuster, he said he wanted to take me somewhere special to watch the sunset. It sounded sweet, so I went along with it, imagining a quiet, romantic moment that might set the tone for the evening. He drove us to a secluded riverbank, and at first, it seemed like a perfect choice. The water shimmered as the sun began to dip below the horizon, and the air was cool and peaceful. The moment had all the makings of a romantic scene straight out of a movie. But nature had other plans. Almost as soon as we got out of the car, bugs began swarming around us, coming off the river in droves. We tried to swat them away, laughing awkwardly, but things took a turn for the worse when hundreds of bats swooped in, circling above our heads. What might have been a charmingly adventurous moment quickly turned into a scene from a low-budget horror film. We raced back to the car, ducking and flailing like lunatics, and slammed the doors shut. Panting and disheveled, we looked at each other and burst out laughing. At least we could both agree it was time to leave. The date, however, was far from salvaged. When we arrived at Blockbuster, I learned that I would need to open an account in order to rent a movie. Confused, I asked why he couldn't just rent one himself. That's when he sheepishly admitted that he was banned from renting movies there. He didn't elaborate on why, and I didn't press him for details, but it was hard not to wonder what on earth someone could do to get banned from a blockbuster. I reluctantly opened an account, telling myself it was no big deal, and we finally picked out a movie. On the way back to his house, he seemed to relax a bit, chatting about how excited he was to watch the movie. Then, almost casually, he dropped the bombshell. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll return the movie first thing tomorrow morning." "Okay," I replied, not understanding why he felt the need to reassure me. "It'll be my only chance to return it," he continued, "because starting Monday, I'm under house arrest for 30 days. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "House arrest?" I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Yeah," he said, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. "It's not a big deal. Just a misunderstanding, really." By this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. Between the bats, the blockbuster ban, and now the revelation of his impending house arrest, I was mentally tallying up all the red flags I'd ignored up to this point. When we got back to his house, I sat through the movie mostly in silence, wondering how I'd managed to end up on a date that felt like a series of escalating plot twists. As soon as the credits rolled, I made an excuse about needing to get up early the next morning and left as quickly as I could. I was asked out on a date by a guy who I thought was very attractive and seemed nice, which I thought I needed at the time. Life was hectic, and a nice dinner with someone charming sounded like just the thing to lift my spirits. When he suggested a fancy restaurant, I appreciated the effort and thought, this might actually go well. But oh, how wrong I was. The evening started fine enough. He picked me up right on time, dressed nicely, and even opened the car door for me. At the restaurant, we were seated at a cozy table with candlelight, the kind of setup that practically screams romantic. I felt hopeful, even excited. Then, the first red flag unfurled. When the server arrived, my date immediately took charge, ordering for both of us. Now, I'm not opposed to a little old-fashioned chivalry, but he didn't even ask what I liked. Worse, he ordered shellfish, a dish I'm allergic to. I politely corrected him, explaining my allergy, and the server looked to me for my preference. Before I could get my order out, my date interrupted with, "Oh, don't worry, it's the best in town. It won't kill you." I stared at him, half expecting him to laugh and say he was joking. He didn't. Not one to be bulldozed, I calmly told the server what I actually wanted and ignored the icy glare my date shot my way. He was offended, and he let me know it, muttering something about how I was undermining him. That was the moment when the evening began its steep decline. After the shellfish incident, he leaned back in his chair, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. With a theatrical flourish, he unfolded it and laid it on the table. Before I could ask what he was doing, he started reading off questions. "What's your biggest fear?" he began, eyes glued to the paper. I paused, thinking he might elaborate or make a joke. Instead, he stared expectantly, pen in hand, as if he were taking notes. "Did you prepare questions in advance?" I asked, trying to hide my surprise. "Oh no," he said enthusiastically. "I Googled good questions to ask on a first date. I want to make sure I cover everything." At first, I tried to roll with it. Maybe he was nervous and overprepared. But it wasn't a conversation, it was an interrogation. Each time I answered, he would reply with exaggerated enthusiasm. "OMG, you're so amazing," or "I just love you," or worse, "I'm going to marry you someday." By the time he got to the end of the list, he was utterly convinced we were soulmates. He leaned across the table and, with a dreamy look, declared, "I've never felt this way about anyone. You're perfect." Meanwhile, I was counting down the minutes until the check arrived. As the dinner finally came to an end, I mentally prepared to power through the ride home and let him down gently the next day. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. As we were leaving, he mentioned seeing some people he knew at a nearby table. "Come on," he said, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward them. "You have to meet my family." I froze. "Your family?" I repeated, unsure I'd heard him right. "Yeah, my parents, grandma, my aunt, and my cousin. They're right over there." Before I could protest, we were standing in front of a table of smiling faces. "This is her," he announced proudly. "This is my fiancée." I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. "Fiancée?" Did he hit his head between the appetizer and dessert? His family's reaction was immediate. They all stood up, beaming and congratulating us, calling for champagne. Hugs and handshakes were exchanged, while I stood there, frozen in horror. I turned to him, my eyes shooting daggers. "What are you doing?" I hissed through gritted teeth. He just grinned at me like a puppy who'd brought his owner a chewed-up shoe. "It felt right," he said. I took a deep breath and addressed the table. "Actually, we're not engaged. This is our first date, and also our last." The disappointment on their faces was palpable. His grandma looked like I'd just told her Santa wasn't real. His parents exchanged awkward glances, clearly unsure how to recover from this revelation. Meanwhile, my date looked utterly crushed. "Excuse me," I said, forcing a polite smile. "I need to use the restroom." Once there, I pulled out my phone and called my friend. "I need you to come get me," I whispered, explaining the situation as quickly as I could. The server, who must have witnessed the entire debacle, saw me leaving the restroom and offered to help me sneak out the back door. I didn't hesitate. I slipped away, leaving my fiancé to explain my sudden disappearance to his bewildered family. I had recently gotten out of a pretty serious relationship, and after 3 months of wallowing in self-pity, I was ready to have someone take me out and make me feel special. My first mistake was hopping on Tinder, but when I swiped right on a friend of a friend I'd met a few times, I thought it was a safe bet. He was mad cute and a smooth talker, so I quickly agreed to go out with him without knowing too much about him. Mistake number 2. We decided to go out for dinner at a nice restaurant. When we got there, he was charming and confident. While we were looking over the menu, he leaned in and said, "Get anything and everything you want." "It's on me." That immediately put me in a great mood. I thought, finally, someone who knows how to treat me. As we waited for the server, I noticed my date seemed unusually comfortable. When the waiter finally came by, they exchanged an animated conversation, like old friends catching up. Turns out, my date worked at the restaurant. Great, I thought, maybe we'll get some awesome perks. But things started to get a little odd. My date excused himself, saying he'd be right back, and then disappeared into the kitchen. 15 minutes passed. At first, I thought he might be grabbing something or chatting with his co-workers, but as the minutes dragged on, I started to feel awkward sitting there alone. Just as I was considering texting him, he returned carrying a food tray loaded with plates. "Here you go," he said, beaming with pride. "I got you anything you wanted." I was a little confused, but also impressed. I dug in enthusiastically, assuming this was some kind of special treatment he'd arranged for me. As I took my first bite, the waiter friend came back, his face tense. He leaned down to whisper something to my date. "Some guys here," the waiter murmured, "so be careful." My date nodded, suddenly looking a little paranoid. Then, without explanation, he got up and went back into the kitchen. I shrugged it off, figuring it had something to do with the manager. Maybe there were rules about employees serving food to friends or family. A few minutes later, the calm of the restaurant shattered. Loud yelling erupted from the kitchen. I looked up, startled, as heads turned in unison toward the commotion. My date came storming out of the kitchen, red-faced, with the manager hot on his heels. The argument spilled into the dining area. Voices rose, and my date pointed in my direction. My stomach dropped as I realized I was now part of whatever was happening. After some back-and-forth yelling, he marched back to the table and slumped into his seat, muttering under his breath. "What happened?" I whispered, trying not to draw even more attention. He sighed heavily. "I got fired," he said. "Fired?" I repeated, stunned. "Yeah," he snapped. "They've been on my case for weeks. The manager's always had it out for me. He's just mad because I was grabbing food for us. It's not even a big deal." I blinked, trying to process his words. "Grabbing food for us? Wait, are you saying the food I'm eating is stolen?" "Well, yeah," he said like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I was mortified. The entire restaurant was now staring at us, and I was sitting there with a plate of stolen food in front of me. My appetite evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of humiliation. As he ranted about the unfair treatment he'd received, I quietly signaled for a to-go box. If this was stolen food, I figured I might as well take it with me, not that I had any intention of eating it later. As I packed up my dinner, my date decided he needed to have one last word with the manager. He got up and stormed back to the kitchen, leaving me alone once again. At that point, I'd had enough. I grabbed my purse, nodded a polite goodbye to the stunned waiter who had witnessed the whole ordeal, and walked out. I've never felt so embarrassed in my life. On the drive home, I replayed the night in my head, trying to figure out how it had gone so spectacularly wrong. How did I end up on a date with someone who thought stealing food from his own workplace was a good idea? And how on earth did he think that yelling at his manager in public was going to win me over? The whole experience scared me off dating for a solid 2 months. It also taught me a valuable lesson. Never assume a friend is a safe bet. And maybe vet your dates a little better before agreeing to go out with them. So my boyfriend at the time and I were on vacation in Bali. It was the perfect getaway, a beautiful, secluded hotel perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The kind of place where everything feels romantic and every moment is meant to be cherished. One night, we decided to switch things up and eat at a Mexican restaurant for dinner. Both of us love spicy food, so naturally, we ordered the spiciest peppers and salsa to put on everything. The food was incredible, and we reveled in the delicious burn of the peppers. There's something satisfying about feeling like you're challenging yourself with spice, almost like it's a badge of honor. We laughed, drank margaritas, and talked about how great the food was, savoring every bite of the fiery meal. Little did we know, we'd soon come to regret that decision. After dinner, we headed back to our room, which was as dreamy as the rest of the hotel. It was designed to be open and outdoorsy, the kind of setup where you feel like you're living in harmony with nature. Our bathroom and shower were outside, offering incredible views of the starry night sky and the sound of waves crashing below. It was the epitome of romance. Feeling the buzz of a great night out, we started hooking up. Things were heating up in all the right ways, and the mood was perfect. We began with a little foreplay, and at first, everything was going great. But then something felt off. What started as pleasurable quickly turned into discomfort. I tried to power through it, thinking maybe I was just imagining things or perhaps I was sore. But within moments, the discomfort escalated into outright pain. It burned, and not in a good way. I tried to focus on the moment, but the sensation became unbearable. That's when it hit me. The peppers. Horrified, I realized that the spice from the peppers was still all over his hands, his mouth, his tongue, and now it was all over me. And not just anywhere, it was in all the wrong places. The pain was immediate and excruciating, like fire spreading wherever his touch had lingered. I jumped up, screaming and crying, the mood completely obliterated. Panic set in as I realized I needed relief immediately. I bolted to the outdoor shower, flinging the door open in the middle of the night. The once beautiful design of the outdoor bathroom now felt like a cruel joke. I stood there, frantically trying to wash away the fiery pain with cold water, while the ocean breeze chilled my soaking wet skin. My boyfriend came running after me, apologizing profusely. He was clearly just as horrified as I was, though part of me couldn't help but feel a twinge of annoyance. "Why didn't you wash your hands better?" I managed to shout through the pain. He muttered something about not realizing the spice would linger like that, but honestly, I couldn't focus on anything other than the burning sensation. At one point, he tried to help by bringing out a glass of milk he'd found in the minibar. I don't know what was more ridiculous, the idea that I'd pour milk all over myself under the outdoor shower, or the fact that he was earnestly suggesting it as a solution. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and let's just say milk ended up being involved. By the time the burning subsided enough for me to think straight, the mood was beyond dead. There was no recovering from that fiasco. We sat there under the stars, me wrapped in a towel, him looking sheepish and repeatedly apologizing. Despite the awkwardness, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Who knew spicy food could lead to such a catastrophic romantic mishap? The next morning, we avoided eye contact with the hotel staff, convinced they'd heard my midnight screaming and assumed the worst. Over breakfast, we tried to recount the incident without cringing too much. "At least we'll never forget this vacation," he said with a nervous chuckle. He wasn't wrong. Soon after venturing into online dating, I met Mary. She was interesting and easy to talk to. She recommended we meet for the first time at a restaurant with great reviews. It was not that great of a place, but despite her questionable meal choice, we had a good enough time and agreed to meet up the following week at a local festival, which I was going to with friends. The day of the festival, we had a pretty good time together, but I realized I wasn't really feeling it, and this probably wasn't going to be long-term. I waited a few days then, later that week, told Mary my feelings. I was as honest as I could be, saying that while I wasn't interested in her romantically, she was fun to spend time with, and I'd like to be friends. I figured being straightforward was the way to go as to avoid any mixed messages. She was upset but understood, or so I thought. I was impressed at how maturely the conversation had gone and figured that was that. I was wrong. A few days later, I was awoken very early on a Sunday morning by a knock on the door of my apartment. I was confused and half asleep, but figured it was a package delivery, so answered it. You can imagine my surprise seeing Mary's mother at the door. Taken aback and completely in shock, I let her in with no idea as to why she was there. She started to cry, no weep, about the demise of Mary and I's very brief relationship. I was completely stunned and had no idea what to say. She repeatedly kept asking me why I couldn't date Mary anymore and begged me to reconsider my decision. I said I was sorry, but I did not see a future with her daughter, but did she want some tea? I honestly had no idea how to console her, or if I should. The whole thing was confusing and bizarre, but she finally left, and I was ready to forget it ever happened. But of course, Mary reached out to me a couple weeks later. She asked to meet up because she needed to talk to me about something. I was hesitant to agree, but figured it would be brief, so we met at a nearby coffee shop. She told me she knew her mom had come by to talk to me, and she was so sorry and extremely embarrassed about the whole thing. Once we had talked through it, she asked if I wanted to start seeing each other again. Again, I had to say no, that I wasn't interested in a relationship with her or her mom. We said our goodbyes, and thank God, this time it was really over. I'm a male in my early 30s, and I've dated a decent amount for the last decade or so. I have talked about this subject with friends, and I have witnessed the struggle, on both sides and in many forms, and I have to say, women have it so much worse. There is really no comparison here. Sure, guys might go on some boring, terrible first dates sometime. You might stumble into a cheater. You might end up dating a girl with dad issues. Fuck it, I said it. But overall, the magnitude in which guys fuck over girls and do stupid shit on dates, and more importantly, in relationships, is so much higher to the inverse situation that it is not worth comparing. Not that anybody is comparing, of course, but if the subject here is men venting about bad dating situations, we should first know this. Tough shit, guys. We have no biological clock. We live in a patriarchal society. Nobody cares about our stories. But still, here's my story. A few years ago, I stumbled onto this familiar face on Tinder. I don't want to say Tinder was new at this point. I don't think it was. But it was a different era. More hookups, perhaps. But overall, it seemed less scummy. In this case, the girl had gone to my high school but graduated like 3 years before I did. I think I was probably around 27 or 28 at the time. She was like 30. She was also divorced. But she had been a collegiate volleyball player, and she had known my older sister, and she was very persistent and upfront after we matched. So I was like, fuck it, sure, let's meet up for a drink sometime. She lived in the suburbs, huge red flag. I lived closer to downtown. But I was trying to be nice, and we were meeting up on like a Tuesday or Wednesday, so I was trying to be flexible. She suggested a fairly stereotypical suburban sports bar chain, not far from where I grew up. This was a little unnerving. Not to sound snobby, but come on. It wasn't Buffalo Wild Wings, but not much better. Still, she was fitting in the meetup after a volleyball league, so I figured we'd meet, get a quick drink, talk a bit, and see if an actual date would be worth it. What's the harm? So, I arrive on time-ish, and she texts to say that she'll be 15 minutes late. No worries, I'm always late. I order a drink. She arrives a few minutes later, and I ask if I can get her a drink. And she says 3 words that always shake me to my core. I don't drink. Okay, this is a tough spot for someone. I get it. We should all probably drink a little less. Maybe she's a raging alcoholic. I'm sympathetic to that. There are many possible scenarios. And being a non-drinker in your early 30s while trying to date is probably very shitty. But I feel like this might be something to be discussed when you make plans for a meetup at a bar. A brief aside, I feel like I've started suggesting coffee places for first dates to accommodate this scenario. But still, come on. So she gets a water, and we go to sit down. But before we even sit down, she gets a text from a volleyball teammate who had just been at her practice or game or whatever. Her car is broken down, and she needs a jump. The girl is super nice about it and feels bad, but she needs to go help her friend. It's going to take like 20 minutes. So I'm like, no worries, I'll just come along. Better than just waiting here. So I down my drink. We hop in the car, and we go off to save this friend. All the while this girl is on her phone like she's trying to navigate a ship across the Atlantic or something. Her friend is only like 8 to 10 minutes away, but it's a fucking ordeal. And she keeps yelling into her phone at a strangely loud volume. So we finally find the girl on the side of a road in the suburbs. We jump the car. It takes about 15 minutes or so. Another friend, this guy named Sergey, shows up and proceeds to help. Sergey seems super nice, but he appears really angry at what's happening, like he's bailed out this friend before. In a minute or two, he's shouting too, very loudly. He appears to know what's wrong with the car, and he thinks he can fix it himself if she'll follow him to Walmart or something. Sergey seems like a real MacGyver type. All the while, I'm standing off to the side like, ook. So, the friend thinks the car will get home. She'll fix it in the morning, she says. So we hop back in the car and head back toward the bar. But no. 2 minutes later, the friend calls again. Her car has stalled, this time on the side of a rather major highway. We speed off to help the friend for a second time. And here's where things really start to go off the rails, because we had driven back toward the bar, and because my date ends up taking a few wrong turns, we end up getting on the highway at a different point a few miles away. So we're actually driving the opposite way the friend was, and we're going to pass her going the other way. But instead of just exiting and getting back on the highway that way, my date pulls this super aggressive U-turn, hopping across a grass median in the process, and then proceeds to pull a second U-turn in the middle of the highway, parking her car the wrong way on the shoulder, so the front of her car is facing the front of her friend's car. You follow this? In my mind, I'm like, holy shit, that was a fucking ballsy maneuver, and not really in a good way. Moments later, Sergey shows up. At this point, I realize he does not have on shoes. Wait, did he ever have shoes? Who can say? We jump the car a second time. It takes like another 25 minutes. And shit is getting dramatic. There's more yelling. By the end, this whole ordeal has taken close to an hour, and I'm spent. My date is apologetic enough. I feel bad too. And I say the typical thing, don't worry about it. We needed to help out your friend. It's not a big deal at all. I wouldn't be doing anything interesting right now anyway. At this point, I guess I'm not totally opposed to a second meetup. Maybe this friend is just helpless, and I kind of feel for her. So we drive back to the bar, where she's going to drop me back at my car. And then it happens. As she parks next to my car, she goes, "By the way, I wanted to show you something. Do you like guns?" Good question. I suppose I don't have anything specifically against guns. I would never own one, and I've never been hunting. But mostly, I've never heard a date say that. Yeah, I guess, I stammer. "Here, let me show you," she says. So she reaches across me, opens the glove box, and pulls out a rather sleek-looking pistol. Again, I know nothing about guns. This one is small, but it looks very nice, I must admit. She tells me what kind of brand it is, and asks if I want to hold it. So for a moment, I sit there, in the parking lot of a suburban sports bar chain, on a first date with a random Tinder match, holding a gun in the passenger seat. After about 5 seconds, I offer the gun back. "Here," I say in probably the lamest voice that has ever come out of my mouth. Moments later, I decide it's time to leave. "Thank you so much," I say. "I had a great time." I went on dates with a mix of men and women prior to meeting my partner, and one such date remains a permanent fixture in my brain. I met up with this girl at Café Madrid after meeting online, and exchanging the usual texts for a week or so. The small introductory talk was fine. She was accomplished, beautiful, and engaging. She also made it clear that she cared deeply for her dogs, a big plus. Everything seemed to be lining up for a great evening. Dinner went well. So well, in fact, that I was invited to her place to meet her dogs. Beautiful woman. Likes dogs. Wants me to come home with her for what I assumed was a thinly veiled interest in coitus and such. Invitation accepted. We walked into her nearby condo and were greeted by 4 adorable border collies. They were enthusiastic, barking and wagging their tails as if I were a long-lost friend. Naturally, I started playing with them on the floor, giving ear scratches and belly rubs, soaking in their exuberant welcome. She settled into a nearby chair, watching me with a smile that seemed equal parts pride and satisfaction. As I was scratching the belly of dog number 3, she suddenly lunged toward me, knocking down a framed picture of her dogs that had been perched on the coffee table. The glass shattered, and she looked visibly upset. "Don't scratch her belly," she exclaimed, almost panicked. "She has sensitive skin." I froze mid-scratch, apologizing profusely. Meanwhile, dog number 3 seemed blissfully unfazed and clearly enjoyed the attention. The situation was bizarre, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just an overprotective pet owner. Things took another strange turn as she became engrossed in an impromptu make-out session with all 4 dogs. They climbed all over her, showering her face with kisses as she cooed and encouraged them. I sat there awkwardly, unsure how to proceed. Politely excusing myself to the restroom, I decided I needed a moment to collect my thoughts. I didn't need to use the bathroom. I needed to contemplate what in the star-spangled fuck had just happened. Leaning against the bathroom sink, I stared at my reflection and debated whether to stay or leave. On one hand, she was gorgeous and clearly loved her dogs. On the other hand, this was rapidly becoming a scene straight out of a surreal comedy. After a few deep breaths, I resolved to course correct and give the evening one last shot. Re-entering the living room, I attempted to lighten the mood. "You've got some lucky pups," I said with a friendly smile. "You love the hell out of those guys." Her face shifted, confusion clouding her features. Then, without warning, her eyes filled with tears. "Love them?" she repeated, her voice trembling. As the tears spilled over, confusion gave way to anger. "I would die for them," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. It wasn't just a declaration, it was a proclamation of martyrdom. I sat there, stunned into silence as she sobbed uncontrollably, clutching one of the dogs to her chest like it was her child. The other three circled her, looking equally confused but decidedly less dramatic. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check the time, and silently weighed my options. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I didn't want to seem rude. After a few minutes, she wiped her tears and composed herself. "So," she said, her tone suddenly calm, "you want to go back to my room and watch a movie?" It was such a whiplash-inducing shift in mood that I didn't know how to respond at first. Finally, I managed, "I think it's best I head out." She didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, looking slightly disappointed but not surprised. As I walked to the door, the border collies followed me, wagging their tails as if they were glad to see me go. When I got home, I replayed the night in my head, wondering how it had gone so spectacularly off the rails. It wasn't the dogs, they were lovely. It was the intensity, the drama, and the sheer unpredictability of it all. It became one of those dates that stays with you not because it was good, but because it was so hilariously absurd. So yeah, now I sleep with men. I had been talking to this guy I met on Tinder for a couple of weeks, and he seemed nice enough. We'd exchanged a steady flow of texts, covering the usual getting-to-know-you topics. Nothing extraordinary, but enough to keep the conversation going. One day, I posted on Snapchat that I was going to get coffee, and he replied, asking if he could join me. Feeling spontaneous, I agreed and gave him the name of the coffee shop where I planned to be. I got there a little early, grabbed a table, and ordered my usual caramel latte. A few minutes later, he walked in. He was as good-looking as his pictures suggested, with a confident swagger that instantly caught people's attention. We exchanged the standard pleasantries, and I thought, okay, maybe this could be fun. The conversation started off fine. Nothing too exciting, but not awkward either. We bonded over being Dominican, sharing a few laughs about cultural quirks and family traditions. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that he knew he was good-looking and enjoyed talking about himself. A lot. I found myself doing more listening than sharing, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just nervous or trying to impress me. Then came the food. He ordered a coffee and 2 appetizers, then another 2, and another 2. By the time the waitress brought out the last round, I had lost count of how many small plates were on the table. It was like watching a human vacuum cleaner in action. "Want some?" he asked, gesturing to the latest dish of mini sliders. "Oh no thanks," I said. "I've got dinner plans with friends later." At this point, I'd only had my caramel latte, which, by the way, was $7. Meanwhile, he had plowed through 6 appetizers, each priced at $14 or more. I wasn't keeping tabs on the bill, but the math was starting to add up in my head, and it wasn't pretty. Finally, the check arrived. The total was over $100. I casually pulled out $10 from my wallet, enough to cover my drink and a tip, and placed it on the table. He looked at me, eyebrows raised. "Are we going to split it?" he asked. I laughed, thinking he was joking. Surely, he didn't expect me to split a bill for food I didn't even touch. But his expression didn't change. He wasn't joking. "I'm not paying for that," I said, still trying to stay polite. "I didn't need any of it." "So," he replied, shrugging. "That was your decision." My jaw practically hit the table. He was serious. Dead serious. I stared at him, trying to process how someone could be this entitled and oblivious. "Have a good day," I said, standing up and grabbing my bag. I wasn't about to argue with someone who clearly lacked basic decency. As I walked toward the door, I heard his voice rise behind me. Wow, really? You're not even going to pay your share. Heads turned as his volume increased. You seem nice, he shouted. I had high hopes for us. This is so disappointing. I didn't turn around. I didn't engage. I just kept walking, letting his rant echo through the restaurant. By the time I stepped outside, I could still hear him yelling, his voice growing fainter as I put more distance between us. On the way home, I replayed the whole debacle in my head, oscillating between disbelief and laughter. Who even does that? The entitlement, the lack of awareness, the sheer audacity of it all. It was one of those dates that makes you question the human condition, but also leaves you with an unforgettable story. Later, I told my friends about it over dinner. We laughed so hard, tears streamed down our faces. So he really thought you'd split a $100 bill when you only had a coffee? One of them asked, still chuckling. Apparently, I replied, and he thought yelling at me in public would somehow change my mind. It's been a while since that date, but it remains a classic in my collection of disaster dating stories. If nothing else, it's a reminder to always clarify the check situation before agreeing to a second drink or 6 appetizers. This one was a bad experience from the start. We tried to go to my favorite local breakfast place that has the best eggs Benedict in town. It's cute, has great staff, a fun environment. Unfortunately, the wait time was about an hour, so I suggested we go somewhere else. We don't have any shortage of breakfast spots around here, and I was ready to suggest a few others when he suggests we go to another classic breakfast spot. Denny's. Okay, sure. Denny's is the place I find myself with friends at 2 a.m. because we wanted a milkshake and fries, at 2 in the morning when there's no other option. Or when you're on a road trip and you have to stop at Denny's at least once because that's what you do. But alright, breakfast date at Denny's it is. By the time we sat down, I already had an inkling that it's going to be a no from me if he asked for another date. At this point, he had told me all about his favorite protein powder and how much he benches. Time passed, we ordered food, and I was doing a lot of nodding and wondering if this guy was ever going to ask me a single question about myself. Finally, the question he chose to ask was what kind of car I drive. I mentioned that I was currently saving up to buy my first car. Oh, no way. That's actually awesome because I'm selling my car. So what's your budget? I'm thinking of selling it for like $5,000. That's pretty reasonable, don't you think? You in? Spoiler alert, I was not in.